The root cellar smelled like wet limestone and something older than that. Wren Callister was standing at the bottom of the stairs with a kerosene lamp in one hand and her other hand pressed flat against the side of her belly, which was big enough now that stairs required planning. Behind the shelf, the wooden shelf she'd been trying to move for 10 minutes because something behind it didn't sound right. When she knocked, there was a small door built into the stone wall set back about 2 inches from the surface and sealed with a wooden latch that someone had carved by hand. And across the top of that door, scratched into the wood with a nail or a knife tip, 5 words for whoever tends the bees. Wren read the words twice. She put the lamp on the shelf. She put both hands on the latch. And then she heard it, the crunch of tires on gravel up above coming from the direction of the county road. Not Odessa. Odessa walked. Whoever was up there had driven, and they hadn't called ahead because nobody called ahead when they were coming to take something. Wren looked at the door. She looked at the ceiling. She left the door closed, climbed the stairs with one hand on the wall, and stepped into the afternoon light of her own kitchen, where the marks on the doorframe, 51 years of them carved in pencil and in ink, and in the last few years in something shaky that might have been crayon, watched across the room like they always did. 2 months earlier, she didn't own a door. She didn't own a room. She didn't own anything except a sewing box with $340 inside it and a baby that was running out of room. If you've ever had to count your money twice because you were afraid the number would be different the second time, this story is for you. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell so you don't miss what happens next, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight. Let's go. 2 months earlier, Wren Callister woke up in a rented room above Maudie Strack's laundromat on Depot Street in Sire, Missouri. And the first thing she noticed was the quiet, not the good kind. The kind that means something that used to be there isn't anymore. She turned her head on the pillow and looked at the nightstand. Garrett's wallet was gone. His phone charger was gone. The wedding ring he always took off before sleeping, because he said it pinched, that was gone too. And the little circle of dust where it usually sat looked like a mark left by something that had been removed from a crime scene. She didn't sit up right away. She lay there on her side with one arm under the pillow and the other resting on her belly. 6 months along, big enough now to enter a room before she did. And she listened. No water running in the bathroom. No boots on the floor downstairs. No truck engine idling in the alley the way it always did when Garrett was warming it up at 5 in the morning. Because he said cold engines burned more gas, which was one of the things he said that sounded true but wasn't. The truck was gone. She knew it before she looked out the window. But she looked anyway because knowing something and seeing it are 2 different kinds of pain. The gravel spot where the Silverado always parked was empty. Tire marks cut through the frost heading east toward the county road. He'd left sometime before dawn, early enough that the frost had formed after he pulled out, which meant the marks were crisp, which meant he hadn't hesitated, which meant he'd planned it. Wren sat on the edge of the bed with her hands flat on the mattress, one on each side of her hips, and breathed. 3 breaths. Her mother had taught her that. Lenore June Callister, who had been a seamstress in Theodosia for 31 years, and who had died with $400 in a sewing box, and no debt to anyone, used to say that 3 breaths was the difference between doing something stupid and doing something that worked. 1 breath to feel it. 2 breaths to name it. 3 breaths to let the name settle into your body so it doesn't rattle around in your head all day making noise. Wren breathed. She named it. He's gone. Then she stood up, which took longer than it used to because of the belly, and went to the bathroom and washed her face with cold water and dried it with the towel that still smelled like his aftershave, which she folded and put in the hamper instead of throwing at the wall. Because throwing things at walls is for people who have the luxury of not needing walls. She went to the closet. His side was empty. 3 wire hangers swung in the draft from the window like skeleton arms waving goodbye. His boots gone. His duffel gone. His jacket with the sheepskin collar that she had mended twice at the left elbow because he kept catching it on the truck door gone. She checked the kitchen drawer. The emergency cash $80 she'd set aside from her last 3 alteration jobs was gone too. He'd taken it. Of course he'd taken it. Garrett had always had a talent for finding money the way some dogs find rabbits, not by understanding where it lived, but by smelling it. Wren opened the sewing box. It was the old one her mother had given her when Wren was 17. Wooden with a brass clasp that stuck unless you pressed it at exactly the right angle, and a false bottom that Lenore had installed herself with a piece of cedar wood and 2 tiny hinges she'd pulled from a jewelry box she'd bought at a yard sale for $1. The false bottom was where the money lived. Garrett didn't know about the false bottom. Garrett didn't know about a lot of things, because Garrett had never once in 4 years of marriage opened his wife's sewing box the same way he'd never once asked her what thread count meant, or why she pressed seams open instead of to one side. $340. 20s and 10s and a few 5s folded flat, smelling like cedar and old thread. It was everything she had in the world that wasn't growing inside her. She counted it twice. The number was the same both times. She put it back under the false bottom and closed the clasp and sat down at the kitchen table with the sewing box in front of her, and her hands resting on the lid like a person resting their hands on a Bible before swearing an oath. She did not cry. She would not have said she was a person who didn't cry. She was a person who cried when things deserved it. This did not deserve it. This deserved 3 breaths and a plan. The plan for the first week was simple. Survive. Maudie Strack, who owned the laundromat and rented the upstairs room month to month, was 63 years old with permed gray hair and hands red from bleach, the way of looking at you that said she'd already figured out what happened and was waiting to see how you'd handle it. When Wren came downstairs that morning and told her the situation, husband gone, truck gone, rent due in 9 days, Maudie listened with her arms crossed and her back against the dryer that always ran hot on the left side. Then she said, "Can you sew curtains?" Wren said she could sew anything. Maudie pointed at the front windows of the laundromat where the curtains had been sun-bleached to the color of old teeth. "Do those and you can stay through the month. I'll put the word out you do alterations." That was how the first 2 weeks went. Wren sewed Maudie's curtains dark blue cotton with a 1-inch hem clean enough that Maudie stood in the doorway looking at them for a full minute without saying anything, which from Maudie was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Word went out. Sayre was small enough that word didn't have far to go. By the end of the first week, Wren had 4 jobs lined up. Mrs. Ormond needed a dress taken in. Herschel Blunt needed his work pants hemmed because he'd lost weight since the surgery and kept stepping on the cuffs. 2 teenage girls from the high school needed prom dresses altered. And they were the kind of alterations that tested your patience because the girls kept changing their minds about the neckline and then changing them back. Wren worked on the floor of the upstairs room with a pincushion on her knee and the sewing box open beside her and the baby pressing against her bladder with the persistence of someone knocking on a door that nobody's answering. She charged fair prices. She did clean work. She didn't talk about Garrett. People asked in Sayre. People always asked, and Wren would say, "He went." And the way she said it closed the subject the way a period closes a sentence. She made $212 in those 2 weeks. She added it to the $340, $552. Enough to survive another month if she was careful. Not enough to survive 2 months with a baby coming. It was on the Thursday of the second week that she heard the conversation in Grinnell's, which was the general store on Sayre's main road, and the place where everything in town was discussed before it was decided. Wren was there, buying thread white size 50 cotton, and 2 men were standing by the register talking the way men talk when they think nobody's listening, which is to say, loudly. One of them, she later learned his name was Orrin Doss, who drove the propane truck, was telling the other that the county had finally put Birch Hill up for tax auction. $1,100 for 8 acres and a stone house and a root cellar and 12 beehives that were rotting into the ground. The other man laughed. Orrin said it wasn't funny. It was sad that old Hollis Birch had lived up there alone for 50-some years, keeping bees and growing his little herb garden and talking to himself. And when he died 5 years back, nobody'd even noticed for a week until Odessa Rhine walked up and found him sitting in his kitchen chair like he was waiting for company that didn't come. The other man said he wouldn't take that property for free. Orin said nobody would. That's why it was $1,100 for 8 acres, which was less than the price of a used transmission. He said the bees were dead, the garden was gone, the roof had moss on it thick enough to graze a goat, and the whole hill smelled like cedar and neglect, and that the county was going to have to drop the price again if nobody bid by the end of the month. Wren put the thread on the counter. She paid. She walked out. She stood on the sidewalk in the late May sun with her hand on her belly and the sewing box in the canvas bag on her shoulder. And she thought about the number 1100 and the number 552 and the distance between them. The distance was $548. That was a lot of money. That was also the difference between renting a room above a laundromat until the money ran out and owning a piece of ground that nobody could take away. Her mother's voice, the one that lived in the back of her head, the way some people keep a radio on low in the kitchen. Her mother's voice said, "A woman who doesn't own her ground is a woman who'll spend her whole life asking permission to stand." Wren went to the county clerk's office the next morning. The clerk was a thin woman named Darlene Teague with reading glasses on a chain and a desk that looked like a paper mill had exploded on it. Wren asked about the Birch Hill property. Darlene pulled a file from a cabinet and laid it open on the counter. Tax auction, minimum bid $1,100. Property description, 8.2 acres unincorporated stone dwelling. Circa 1940 root cellar. Well 12B colony structures, assorted outbuildings. Condition uninhabitable. Access 2.1 miles of unpaved county road from Route 14. Last occupied 2019. Wren read the description twice. She asked if there was a payment plan. Darlene looked at her over the reading glasses. In tax auctions, she said you could put down a deposit minimum 40% and pay the balance within 90 days. If you didn't pay the balance, you lost the deposit and the property went back to auction. 40% of $1,100 was $440. Wren had 552. Can I see it first? Darlene gave her directions. County road off Route 14 north, 2 miles fork left at the dead oak, follow the track up. You'll know it when you see it, Darlene said. It's the one that looks like it gave up. Wren went the next day. She left at 6 in the morning to beat the heat, which in late May, Missouri, was already serious by 9. She walked because she didn't have a truck anymore, and because the baby weight made her hips ache on bus seats, and because walking was free. Route 14 to the county road. County road to the fork at the dead oak, which was exactly where Darlene said it would be leafless and white against the sky like a hand reaching up out of the ground. Left at the fork, up. The track climbed through cedar and scrub oak and limestone ledges that jutted from the hillside like broken teeth. The air smelled like hot rock and cedar sap, and something green underneath that she couldn't name, but that her body recognized as alive. Cicadas screamed from every direction. A red-tailed hawk circled above the tree line, patient, watching something in the grass that didn't know it was being watched. She was sweating hard by the time the track leveled out. Her feet hurt. Her back hurt. The baby was pressing down in a way that made every step feel like it might be the last one before something gave. But the track leveled, and the cedars opened. And there it was, Birch Hill. The house was small. Stone walls hand-laid with mortar the color of old bone. 1-story low-roofed with a wooden porch across the front that sagged on the left side where a post had rotted through. The roof was green with moss. 2 windows faced the track, both shuttered, one shutter hanging by a single hinge. The porch had a rocking chair on it taped onto its side, and a clay pot with something dead in it. To the right of the house, 12 wooden beehives stood in 2 rows of 6, all of them gray and weathered. Several leaning one collapsed entirely into a pile of slats and a wax comb that the rain had turned to mush. Behind the house, a hillside garden, or what had been a garden, climbed in terraces held by dry stacked stone walls. The terraces were buried in thistle and foxtail and something with purple flowers that she didn't recognize. But the walls were holding. The stone was good. Beyond the garden downhill and to the east, she could hear water, a creek, running water. In the Ozarks, running water on your own property was worth more than money, because money ran out and creeks didn't. She walked to the front door. It was locked with a padlock, but the hasp was loose and the screws pulled out of the wood with almost no effort. The door swung inward. The smell hit first. Damp stone, old wood, dust that had been sitting so long it had developed a personality. But underneath that, something else, dried herbs faint, hanging in the air, the way a song hangs in a room after the radio's been turned off. The kitchen was straight ahead, small, clean lined with a stone counter built into the wall and a wood stove that looked like it had been forged in a century that didn't exist anymore. Iron sink, wooden shelves. A window above the sink shuttered from outside, letting in blades of light through the slats. And on the door frame between the kitchen and the front room, the marks. Wren saw them and stopped walking. They started at about 5'6" and went up to about 5'10", and then came back down slowly over the last decade of entries to about 5'8". Each mark was a horizontal line with a date written next to it in pencil or pen, or in the later years, something thick like crayon or grease pencil. The earliest she could read was 1967. The latest was 2018. 51 years, 51 marks. One man standing in this doorway every year, she guessed January, because several of the dates she could read were in January, putting his back against the wood and drawing a line at the top of his head and writing the date. The last mark, 2018, was not straight. It wavered. The pencil line trembled the way a hand trembles when the arm it's attached to isn't strong enough to hold it steady. And the number was written small, cramped, like the person writing it knew it might be the last one. Wren put her hand on the 2018 mark. The wood was smooth under her fingers, worn by decades of someone's back leaning against it. She stood there with her palm flat on the doorframe and her other hand on her belly, and she felt something she had not expected to feel in a house that smelled like dust and herbs and 5 years of nobody. She felt recognition, not of the place, of the gesture. A man standing alone in his own kitchen, measuring himself against a wall because there was nobody else to witness that he was still here. Not growing, not shrinking, just still here. Still standing in his doorway, still marking the year. Her mother used to say that houses tell you who lived in them if you stand still long enough to listen. Wren stood still. She listened. The house told her that the man who lived here had been careful and quiet and alone, and that he had measured himself every year not out of vanity, but out of something closer to defiance. I'm still here. The line proves it. She walked through the rest of the house slowly. Front room, small stone floor, one window. Bedroom, smaller iron bed frame with no mattress. A wooden trunk against the wall with a padlock on it. Back door opening onto the garden terraces. Root cellar entrance to the right of the back door. A heavy wooden hatch set into the ground at an angle with stone steps going down into dark. She didn't go down, not yet. She went to the well instead, which was behind the house near the first garden terrace. Stone lined with a hand crank and a bucket on a rope. She lowered the bucket. It hit water at about 15 feet. The water that came up was cold and clear and tasted like limestone, and nothing else, which is what good water tastes like. She stood at the well with the bucket in her hands and the sun on her face, and the baby moving inside her, with that slow roll that meant contentment, not protest. And she looked at the house and the garden, and the dead beehives and the cedars, and the hillside dropping away toward the creek. She could hear but not see. $1,100. She had $552. 40% down was $440. That left her $112 to live on. 90 days to come up with the remaining $660. With the baby coming in 3 months, it was impossible. Any reasonable person would have said so. Any reasonable person would have walked back down the hill and found a cheaper room and waited tables or cleaned houses until the baby came and then figured out the next thing. But Wren was not thinking about reasonable. She was thinking about the marks on the doorframe. 51 years of a man saying, "I'm still here." She was thinking about her mother's sewing box with the false bottom and how her mother had kept money in it for 31 years without her father ever finding it, not because her father was stupid, but because he never looked at the things he didn't think mattered. She was thinking about the creek she could hear and the well that gave clean water and the stone walls that were holding the terraces even after 5 years of nobody asking them to. She walked back to Sire. 2 hours downhill, easier than up, but harder on the knees. She went straight to the county clerk's office. Darlene Teague was eating a sandwich at her desk. Wren put the sewing box on the counter, pressed the clasp at the exact right angle, lifted the lid, lifted the false bottom, and counted out $440 in 20s and 10s and 5s. Darlene watched her count. When Wren finished, Darlene put down the sandwich, wiped her fingers on a paper napkin, and counted the money again herself. Then she pulled a form from the second drawer, filled in the property description, the amount, the date, and slid it across the counter with a pen. Balance due in 90 days. You miss it, you lose the deposit, and the property goes back to auction. You understand that. I understand it. You know the condition of that property. I walked it this morning. Darlene looked at her, at the belly, at the sewing box, at the $112 still sitting on the false bottom. And something moved across her face that wasn't pity and wasn't admiration, but was somewhere in the territory between the two where women recognize each other. Sign on the line. Wren signed. Darlene stamped the form, filed the original, handed Wren the carbon copy. Wren folded it once carefully and put it in the inside pocket of her jacket, the one that buttoned. She walked out of the clerk's office into the late afternoon sun with a sewing box that now held $112 and a piece of paper that said she owned 8 acres of Ozark hillside that nobody else had wanted. She had no truck, she had no furniture, she had no husband, no family within 300 miles, no plan for the $660 she still owed, and a baby that was going to arrive whether or not the roof had moss on it. She started walking. 2 hours uphill. She'd done it that morning, and she did it again. The sun was orange and low by the time she reached the top, throwing long shadows from the cedars across the track. The house sat in that light the way old stone sits in late sun, warm-looking, almost soft, as if the day had spent its last hour trying to convince her she'd made the right choice. She pulled the loose hasp off the door, stepped inside, set the sewing box on the stone counter in the kitchen, stood in the doorway where the marks were, and looked at them in the fading light. 51 years of Hollis Birch saying, "I'm still here." She took the pencil from her jacket pocket, the one she used to mark fabric, and she made a small mark on the doorframe. Not a height mark, a date, today's date. And next to it she drew a small circle. The circumference of her belly measured that morning, with the tape she used for waistbands, 41 inches. It was the first mark on that doorframe that wasn't Hollis Birch's. It looked small next to his 51 years. It looked like a beginning. She found a candle in the kitchen shelf, half burnt, still good. She lit it with the matches from her pocket. She laid her jacket on the stone floor of the kitchen, folded her second shirt into a pillow, pulled the blanket from her bag over her legs, and lay down. The baby moved. That slow, deep roll. Not kicking, turning, settling in. The way a person turns in bed when they've found the position that fits. Wren put both hands on her belly. She could feel an elbow or a knee. Something hard and specific and alive pressing against her palm like a handshake through a wall. She spoke out loud. She had not spoken to the baby out loud before. She had thought things at the baby, and she had hummed. And once she had whispered something in the shower that she couldn't remember afterward. But she had not spoken out loud because speaking out loud to a baby that hasn't been born yet felt like making a promise, and Wren had learned to be careful with promises. But tonight, in the dark kitchen of a stone house on a hill in the Ozarks, with a candle burning on a plate, and the sound of the creak coming through the walls, and the marks of a stranger's lifetime watching from the doorframe, she spoke. "This is home. It doesn't have much yet, doesn't have a mattress or a working stove or a plan for next month. But it's ours. Nobody gave it to us, and nobody can take it back. The man who lived here before us measured himself every year on that doorframe so he'd know he was still here. I measured us today. We're here too." The candle flickered. The creek ran. The cicadas outside picked up their rhythm, that long electric pulse that sounds like the earth breathing. Somewhere on the hillside, a whippoorwill started up, and it sang 3 notes over and over, with the patience of something that has all night and knows it. Wren closed her eyes. The baby settled. The house held them both the way stone holds, without moving, without asking, without any intention except to stay where it was put and let whatever came inside it rest. She slept. And in the morning, before the sun cleared the cedar line, she was already up, already pulling water from the well, already sweeping the kitchen floor with a broom she'd made from cedar branches tied with twine, already beginning the work of turning a place nobody wanted into a place that wanted her back. But what she didn't know yet, what she wouldn't know for 3 more days, until she moved the shelf in the root cellar and found the door with 5 words carved across the top, was that Hollis Birch had been waiting for her. Not her specifically. He didn't know her name or her face or the shape of the life that would bring her up his hill. But he had been waiting the way a man who plants a tree is waiting for someone he'll never meet to sit in its shade. He had left something behind that door, and what it was and what it said and what it meant for Wren and for the baby and for the hill itself, that's where this story turns. And if you're lying in bed right now thinking about a door you haven't opened yet, or a place you've been afraid to go back to, or a mark on a wall that somebody left for you to find, stay with me. Part 2 is where the door opens. The shelf in the root cellar was heavier than it looked. Wren had been trying to move it since Tuesday, pulling from the left side, then the right, then bracing her foot against the wall and leaning her weight back. Which is not a thing a woman 6 months pregnant should do, but is a thing a woman 6 months pregnant does when she doesn't have anyone to ask for help, and the shelf is between her and something she needs to understand. The root cellar itself was cleaner than she'd expected. Stone walls, stone floor, stone ceiling with heavy oak beams that had darkened to the color of molasses over the decades but hadn't bowed. Hollis Birch had built it, or whoever built it had built it, the way Hollis seemed to have built everything slowly, correctly, without any interest in being admired for the work. The stairs were solid. The air was cool even in the June heat, which was the whole point of a root cellar, and the shelves along the left wall still held rows of empty mason jars with their lids rusted to a pale orange. But the shelf on the back wall was the one that bothered her. It was deeper than the others set flush against the stone. And when she'd knocked on the wall behind it on her second day, the way you knock on things when you're learning a house, the way you tap a melon at the store, the sound came back hollow. Not stone hollow, space hollow. Something behind it that wasn't wall. On the 5th morning, she wrapped a rag around the base of the shelf for grip, squatted with her knees wide around the belly, and pulled. The shelf scraped forward 3 inches. She breathed, pulled again. 6 inches, enough to see behind it. The door was small, maybe 4 feet high, 2 feet wide, set into a recess in the stone wall. Wooden plank construction, old, with a hand-carved latch, and across the top, scratched deep into the grain for whoever tends the bees. Wren unlatched it. The wood swung inward on leather hinges that cracked but held. Behind the door was a space the size of a closet, maybe 4 feet deep, with a single wooden shelf built to the far wall. On the shelf, a tin box, the kind that once held biscuits or tobacco, sealed shut with a twist of baling wire. Next to it, stacked neatly, 6 composition notebooks with marbled covers, the spines soft with age. She took the tin box first, carried it up the stairs into the kitchen, set it on the stone counter, and unwound the wire with her fingers. The lid came off with a sound like a small breath being released. Silver coins. 38 of them stacked in short columns inside the box, each one separated from the next by a square of wax paper that had gone translucent with age. Some were Morgan dollars, heavy and cool in the hand. Some were older, smaller, worn smooth at the edges from years of being handled. Wren didn't know what they were worth individually, but she knew what silver was worth by weight. And 38 coins was more money than she had held in one place since the day she'd counted her mother's savings after the funeral. Under the coins, a folded envelope. Cream-colored, thick, sealed with a circle of candle wax that had cracked but not broken. She opened it carefully, the way she opened old fabric along the grain, not against it. The letter inside was written in blue ink on lined paper torn from one of the composition notebooks. The handwriting was small and precise in the early lines and grew larger and less steady toward the bottom, as if the person writing it had started with control and ended with urgency. She read it standing up in the kitchen because sitting down didn't occur to her. My name is Hollis Birch. I have lived on this hill for 52 years. I bought the land in 1967 with wages from the sawmill in Ava, and I have not left it since, except to buy supplies, and once to see a doctor in Springfield who told me something I already knew, which was that I was going to die, and that it would not be quick, but it would not be as slow as I feared. I have no wife. I have no children. I have a nephew named Palmer Gault, who lives in Springfield and who has visited me twice in 30 years, both times, to ask what the property was worth. I have not answered him either time because the answer is not a number. I have been keeping bees since 1969. I have been growing herbs since 1972. I have written down everything I know in the notebooks that are next to this box. If you are reading this letter, you have found the door, which means you are living in this house, which means the bees are yours now, and the herbs are yours, and the creek, and the well, and the cedar, and the hill. The coins are for whoever finds this box and stays, not for Palmer. Palmer will sell the land the week I die, and I have made my peace with that because I cannot stop it. But I can leave these coins where Palmer will not look, because Palmer does not look at things that require bending down and getting dirty. The condition is simple. Tend the bees, tend the land. Do not let the hill go back to nothing. I have spent 52 years learning what this ground wants to grow, and I have written it down for you. The notebooks are my gift. The coins are my apology for not being here to show you in person. If you have questions, find Odessa Rhine. She lives down the creek path past the big sycamore 2 miles south. She knows what I didn't write down. Hollis Birch, January 2019. Wren set the letter on the counter next to the coins. She put both hands on the edge of the stone and leaned forward and closed her eyes. The baby kicked not the slow roll of comfort, but a sharp jab, the kind that comes when the mother's heartbeat changes and the baby notices. She went back down to the root cellar and brought up the notebooks. Carried them in 2 trips because she couldn't hold all 6 and manage the stairs with the belly. Set them on the kitchen counter in order they were numbered on the front covers in the same blue ink 1 through 6. She opened the first one, dated entries starting March 1969. Soil temperature, rainfall, hive placement, which herbs went where, when the black locust bloomed because that was the first major nectar flow, and the bees needed it after winter, where the wild bergamot grew along the creek, and how to transplant it without killing the roots, how to build a hive box from cedar planks, and how to render beeswax, and how to know when a queen was failing by the pattern the brood made on the comb. 52 years of a man talking to paper because there was no one else to talk to. Not complaining, not philosophizing, just recording the way a farmer records the way a person who respects the ground writes down what the ground tells them so it won't be lost. In the 6th notebook on the last page with writing. The handwriting large, now shaky, the ink bleeding where the pen had pressed too hard, Hollis had written, "The bees will leave when I do. They always know. But they will come back if someone gives them a reason. Bees don't care who you are. They care if you show up." Wren closed the notebook. She sat on the floor of the kitchen with all 6 notebooks in her lap and the coins on the counter above her, and the late afternoon light cutting through the window slats in golden bars. And she did not cry, but something in her chest shifted the way a door shifts when the frame has settled, and the latch finally catches the strike plate, and the door closes properly for the first time. She was not starting from zero. Hollis had started for her. He'd left the road marked. That night, she read until the candle burned to a stub. She read about bee diseases and herb drying, and how to clear a clogged well screen with vinegar and gravel. She read about the time a black bear tore apart 3 hives in 1983 and how Hollis rebuilt them with thicker walls and a strand of electric fence powered by a car battery. She read about the winter of 1994 when the creek froze and he melted snow for the bees, because bees need water even in January, which is something most people don't know. She fell asleep on the kitchen floor with the first notebook open on her chest, and the baby pressing against her ribs like it was trying to read too. The next morning, she started the real work. She picked the 3 least damaged hive boxes and dragged them to the flat spot behind the house where Hollis's note said the morning sun hit first. She cleaned them with creek water and a brush she made from cedar bark. She scraped out the old comb black with age crumbling and stacked the usable frames on the porch to dry. Her hands smelled like beeswax and rot for 3 days. She pulled thistle from the first garden terrace, working on her knees because bending at the waist was no longer an option. The ground underneath was dark and loose, the kind of soil that had been worked for decades and remembered it. She found volunteer dill growing between the stones of the terrace wall and oregano, and something she later identified from Hollis's notebook as lemon balm. They'd survived 5 years of neglect the way tough things survive, by going quiet and waiting. She made mistakes. She pulled up a row of what she thought was grass and realized 2 hours later, reading that night, that it was garlic chives that Hollis had planted in 1991. She over-tightened the well crank and the handle snapped off, and she spent half a day carving a replacement from a cedar branch with her sewing scissors, which dulled them. She burned the first batch of cornbread she tried to make in the wood stove because she hadn't figured out the damper yet, and the oven ran too hot on the right side. But she figured things out the way her mother had taught her, by doing them wrong once and then doing them right. The replacement crank handle held. The second cornbread came out even. The garlic chives, once she realized what they were, got transplanted to the herb terrace where Hollis's notebook said they belonged. It was on the 8th day that Odessa Wren appeared. Wren was behind the house, kneeling in the second terrace, with a hand trowel she'd made from a flattened tin can when she heard footsteps on the front path. Not sneaking, not hurrying, walking with the rhythm of someone who had walked that path so many times their feet didn't need instructions. She came around the side of the house, wiping dirt on her thighs, and saw a woman standing at the edge of the porch. Small, thin, white hair pulled into a braid that hung over one shoulder. Brown skin weathered to the texture of good leather. She wore a dark cotton dress that had been washed so many times it had lost its original color and settled into something between gray and blue, and over the dress a canvas apron with pockets full of things that rustled. In her right hand, a walking stick made from a piece of ironwood, dark and polished by years of grip. In her left, a cloth sack tied with twine. At her feet, sitting in the dust with the patience of a dog who has been told to wait and has decided to take it literally, was a hound of indeterminate breed and considerable age. Dun and gray, with ears too long for his head, and a belly that suggested a life of regular meals and minimal ambition. He looked at Wren. He did not get up. The woman looked at Wren too. She took in the belly, the dirt-caked knees, the tin can trowel, the cedar bark brush leaning against the porch rail, the 3 cleaned hive boxes drying in the sun. Her eyes moved across all of it the way a person reads a page left to right, top to bottom, missing nothing. Saw smoke from your chimney Tuesday. Waited to see if it kept going. It kept going. So here I am. She said it the way you'd say, the sun came up this morning. Fact, not introduction. Her voice was low and dry, the kind of voice that sounded like it had been used sparingly for 75 years and had plenty left. I'm Wren. I know who you are. Darlene Teague told the whole town a pregnant woman bought Hollis's Hill with cash from a sewing box. In Cellar, that's the kind of story that travels faster than the mail. She looked at the hive boxes. You cleaning those, trying to. You know anything about bees? I'm learning. Odessa made a sound that was either approval or doubt. She set the cloth sack on the porch. Seed, squash beans, dill, basil. All from my stock, all Ozark adapted. All of them will grow in that soil if you don't drown them. She pointed at the second terrace with the walking stick. Hollis planted his squash up there because the drainage is better. He was right. Don't move them. Thank you. Odessa looked at her again, that long measuring look. How far along? 6.5 months. Father, gone. Odessa nodded once as if that answer was a door she had opened many times before and knew exactly what was behind it. She didn't say she was sorry. She didn't ask for details. She reached down and scratched the hound behind one ear. This is Cleet. He'll follow me home tonight, but he'll be back tomorrow on his own. He does that. Don't feed him from the table or he'll never leave. Then she turned and walked back down the path with the same unhurried steps she'd arrived with. Cleet watched her go. He looked at Wren. He looked at the porch. He lay down in the dust next to the porch steps and put his chin on his paws and closed his eyes. And he did not follow Odessa home that night or any night after. Odessa came back the next morning with a jar of sourwood honey and a flat of herb seedlings in recycled tin cans. She came the morning after that with a ball of cotton twine and a lesson on how to tie a tomato cage that wouldn't fall over in the wind. She came every day after that except Sundays, arriving around 7, leaving around 11. Never staying for lunch, because she said lunch was a meal you earned by being done working, not by being in the middle of it. She taught Wren what the notebooks couldn't, how the soil on the north terrace held moisture longer and was better for the basil. How to read the clouds above the creek valley, for rain high and thin meant dry low, and purple meant get the laundry in. How to seal a hive box joint with a paste made from beeswax and pine resin that Hollis had invented and that Odessa had watched him make for 30 years. How to tell a healthy queen cell from a failing one by the shape of the cap. She did not take over. She stood next to Wren and pointed and explained, and then she stepped back and let Wren do it wrong and then right. When Wren asked how she knew all this, Odessa said, I watched Hollis for 40 years. I watched him the way you watch someone who's doing something you might need to know later. Turns out later came. One afternoon, halfway through the second week, Odessa walked into the kitchen and stopped. She was looking at the doorframe. At Hollis's marks, the 51 years of them, and at Wren's new mark, the date and the belly circumference small and fresh next to the old ones. Odessa stood there for a long time. She reached out and touched one of the middle marks, 1989, with her index finger. Her hand stayed there. Then she pulled it back and turned away and said without looking at Wren, He measured himself every January. I asked him once why. He said it was proof of attendance. She didn't say anything else about it. She picked up the twine she'd come for and went back outside. 2 days later, Wren found something on the porch that hadn't been there the night before. A jar of blackberry preserves with no label. She asked Odessa. Odessa said it wasn't her. The next morning, a paper sack of cornmeal appeared by the well. The morning after that, a ball of baling wire on the porch rail. No notes, no names, no footprints she could track. Odessa, when asked, smiled in a way that was almost invisible. Small towns talk. Most of what they say is useless. But sometimes talking leads to doing, and doing doesn't need a name on it. Wren didn't press. She used the preserves. She used the cornmeal. She used the wire to fix the porch rail where it wobbled. She understood that being helped without being asked to say thank you was its own kind of gift, the kind that doesn't create debt. By the third week, the garden was producing. The squash seedlings had taken. The beans were climbing the stakes she'd cut from cedar. The lemon balm and oregano along the first terrace wall were spreading into the gaps the thistle had left. The 3 cleaned hive boxes stood empty in the sun waiting. And then, on a Thursday morning in early July, Wren was on the porch stitching a tear in her one good shirt when she heard it. A sound like static electricity in the air, but organic, alive, directional. She looked up. A cloud of bees, moving across the hillside from the direction of the creek, low and dense, maybe 15 feet off the ground, humming with that frequency that you don't just hear, but feel in the bones behind your ears. A swarm. Thousands of them flying in a mass that shifted and turned and reformed like a murmuration of starlings heading for the hive boxes. Wren set down the shirt. She stood up slowly. She watched the swarm approach the first box, circle it twice, and then begin to pour into the entrance like water through a funnel. The hum intensified, and then settled into something lower, steadier, the sound of bees deciding this was home. They filled the first box. The overflow moved to the second. By the time Odessa arrived an hour later, walking faster than usual. Her face unreadable, the first 2 hive boxes had colonies, and the third had scouts investigating the entrance. Odessa stood next to Wren at the edge of the garden and watched the bees working. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The hum filled the space between them, the way music fills a room, making silence unnecessary. Finally, Odessa said, "Hollis always said they'd come back if someone gave them a reason." Wren had her hand on her belly. The baby was moving that slow, deep roll that meant paying attention. She said to the baby and to the bees and to no one in particular, "They came back." She made a new mark on the doorframe that night. The date. The barely 44 inches now. And next to it, in small letters, bees returned. The first time Palmer Gold came was on a Wednesday, mid-July. Wren was carrying water from the well when she heard an engine on the county road, which was unusual because the county road went nowhere except Birch Hill, and nobody drove up Birch Hill on purpose. The vehicle that appeared at the top of the track was a black Escalade, freshly washed, absurdly clean against the dust and cedar. A man got out, 50s thick at the middle, with a polo shirt tucked into khakis and loafers that had never touched unpaved ground. He stood by the Escalade and looked at the house and the garden and the hive boxes the way a person looks at a restaurant menu, not with interest, but with assessment. Wren set the water bucket down. She walked to the edge of the porch. She did not invite him closer. He smiled. The smile arrived before any words did, which was the first wrong thing. "Afternoon. I'm Palmer Gold, Hollis Birch's nephew. Well, grandnephew, technically. I handled the estate." He said handled the estate the way people say I took care of it, meaning he'd signed papers and deposited checks and done nothing that involved bending down or getting dirty. "I know who owned this land before me." Right. I heard someone moved in. Wanted to come up and, well, welcome you, I suppose. See how the old place is holding up." His eyes moved past her to the kitchen window, the root cellar hatch, the garden. They lingered on the hive boxes. "I see you've been busy. Can I help you with something?" He put his hands in his pockets. "I'll be straight with you. There are some personal items of my uncle's that I believe are still in the house. Family things, sentimental value. I'd like to collect them, if that's all right." The house was empty when I moved in. Well, sometimes things get left in places people don't think to look. Cellars, attics, that sort of thing. If you'd let me just... The house was empty when I moved in. There's nothing here that belongs to anyone but me. Palmer's smile changed. The warmth went out of it the way heat goes out of a stone when the sun moves. What was left was the shape of a smile without any of the purpose. "Ma'am, I don't want to make this difficult. I'm just asking to take a look around." "And I'm telling you there's nothing to look at." He stood there. She stood on the porch. The bees hummed from the hive boxes behind the house. Cleet, who had been sleeping under the porch, came out and sat next to Wren's feet and looked at Palmer with the calm disinterest of a dog who has already categorized a person and filed them under not worth the energy. Palmer nodded slowly. "All right, I'll come back another time. He got in the Escalade, back down the track. The dust hung in the air for a long time after he was gone. Wren told Odessa the next morning. Odessa listened, leaning on the ironwood stick, eyes half closed, nodding at intervals that didn't correspond to the words, but to some internal rhythm of processing. When Wren finished, Odessa said, Palmer Galt is the kind of man who sells a house and then comes back to check if you left anything in the drawers. Hollis couldn't stand him. Told me once that Palmer had the moral compass of a shopping cart, points whichever way the ground tilts. He'll come back. He will, with paper. Men like Palmer always come back with paper because paper makes them feel like they're right. Odessa was right about the timing, wrong about the interval. She'd guessed weeks. It was 12 days. Wren was in the kitchen at dawn reading Notebook 4 by lamplight when she heard the engine again. Earlier this time, Palmer learning that she was an early riser, or Palmer wanting to catch her off guard, or both. She went to the window. The Escalade same as before, but this time Palmer was alone, and in his hand he carried a folded document that he held in front of his body like a hall pass. Wren stepped onto the porch. Odessa was not there. She wouldn't arrive for another hour. Cleet was there under the steps, and he came out and stood beside her. In that way he'd started doing, close enough that she could feel his ribs against her calf. Palmer stopped at the porch edge. He held up the paper. I want to do this properly. I've got documentation here, family estate records showing that certain personal property belonging to my uncle was never included in the tax auction sale. Personal effects, heirlooms, that sort of thing. I have a right to retrieve them. Show me the paper. He unfolded it. Wren came down the 2 porch steps carefully, one hand on the rail, the belly enormous now at 7.5 months, and took the paper from his hand. She read it. She read it again. It was typed on plain white paper. No letterhead, no court seal, no notary stamp, no case number. It said that Palmer Galt, a surviving family member of Hollis Birch, claimed the right to retrieve personal belongings from the property at Birch Hill. It was signed by Palmer Galt. It was witnessed by no one. Wren handed it back. You wrote this yourself. Palmer's jaw tightened. It's a formal claim. It's a piece of paper with your name on it. I could write one that says I own the moon. Wouldn't make it true. She climbed the porch steps. She reached into her apron pocket and took out the padlock she'd bought in town the week before, with the $12 she'd earned hemming Mrs. Ormond's second dress. She locked the porch gate, the gate she'd built from cedar planks, and Hollis's leftover hinges hung on Tuesday level on the first try. She locked it while Palmer watched. If you have a legal claim, bring a lawyer. Bring a judge's order. Bring something with a seal on it. Until then, you're standing on my property and I'm asking you to leave. Palmer's face went dark. You don't know what you're sitting on up here. I know exactly what I'm sitting on. 8 acres, a stone house, a root cellar, 3 working beehives, and a garden that's already producing. I know because I built it. What I don't know is what you think you're going to find in a house you sold for $1,100 without ever setting foot inside it. That landed. She saw it land. Palmer opened his mouth, closed. It opened it again. This isn't over. Wren didn't answer. She turned and walked into the house and closed the door and sat down at the kitchen counter and put her hands flat on the stone, the same stone where Hollis's tin box had sat 3 weeks ago, and she breathed. 1, 2, 3, her mother's count. Cleet came in through the back door and lay down next to her feet. His tail thumped once on the stone floor. Outside, the Escalade started reversed and gravel crunched down the track until the sound was swallowed by the cedars. That evening, Odessa came late, not at 7, but at 4, walking fast, the ironwood stick striking the path harder than usual. She had heard. Sayre was small. Palmer had stopped for gas on the way back to Springfield and said things to the attendant about the woman on Birch Hill, and the attendant had told Grinnell, and Grinnell had told Maudie Strack, and Maudie had called the one person in the valley who didn't own a phone by sending her grandson up the creek path on a bicycle. Odessa sat on the porch with Wren. The evening was warm and the bees were finishing their last flights of the day, coming home heavy with pollen, landing on the boxes with that clumsy purpose that bees have when they're loaded. He doesn't have a claim. The tax auction cleared the title. Personal property left in a structure transfers with the sale if the previous owner doesn't claim it within the statutory period, and the statutory period was 5 years, and Palmer spent those 5 years in Springfield selling condos and not driving up this hill once. I know because I watched. How do you know the law? Odessa looked at her. I'm 75 years old. I've buried 2 husbands, fought a bank over a deed, and helped 9 women in this county keep property that men tried to take from them. You don't need a law degree for that. You need a long memory and a willingness to stand in a doorway and not move. She reached into the apron and pulled out a padlock heavier than the one Wren had bought. For the root cellar hatch. He'll try that next if he comes back. Men like Palmer always go for the door you didn't think to lock. Wren took the lock. Their hands touched for a moment. Odessa's fingers were dry and hard and warm, the hands of a woman who had spent her life picking things up and putting them down and not dropping anything that mattered. They sat on the porch until the light went purple behind the cedars. Cleat snored between them. The bees settled. The creek ran. Somewhere down the valley, a screech owl started its tremolo, and the sound threaded through the evening like a needle through cloth. Wren made a mark on the doorframe before bed, the date, 45 inches. And next to it, small he came. I stayed. 3 marks now below Hollis's 51. 3 moments of a woman saying what the old man had said for half a century in pencil and ink and shaky crayon, I'm still here. But what Wren didn't know, what she wouldn't learn until the first Thursday of August, when a truck she recognized by the sound of its engine appeared at the bottom of the county road at 4 in the afternoon, moving slow like a man trying to decide whether to keep driving, was that Palmer Gault was not the only ghost coming back up that hill. The truck was a Silverado, gray, dented on the passenger side where it had hit a mailbox in Rolla 2 years ago. The driver didn't honk, didn't call out, just sat at the bottom of the track with the engine idling, and Wren standing at the kitchen window with both hands on the counter and the baby pressing down hard against her pelvis. At 8 months, knew who it was before the door opened. She knew the way the engine knocked. She knew the way the driver's side door stuck and needed a hip check to open. She knew, and her hands went flat on the stone the way they always did now when she needed to feel something solid underneath her. Garrett was back, and this time he didn't want the money. He was thinner. That was the first thing she noticed when he finally walked up the track, because he sat in the truck for a full 10 minutes before he opened the door. And Wren watched from the kitchen window the entire time, counting seconds, the way she counted stitches steady, even refusing to rush. Thinner in the shoulders, thinner in the face. His hair was longer than he'd ever worn it when they were together, curling over his collar, in a way that looked less like a choice and more like a man who'd stopped looking in mirrors. He stopped at the porch gate, the locked gate. He put his hands on the top rail and looked at the house, at the new curtains in the windows, the repaired porch post, the garden terraces climbing the hillside behind the hive boxes humming in the late sun. He looked at all of it with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the easy charm, not the restlessness, something closer to arithmetic, a man adding up what was in front of him and realizing the total was higher than he'd expected. Wren came out the front door. Cleet came with her, pressing close to her leg, not growling, but not relaxed either. His ears forward and his weight shifted to his front paws. The baby pressed down hard inside her, and she put one hand on the porch rail and the other on her belly, and she stood there. Garrett looked at the belly. He hadn't seen it at 8 months. He'd left when it was barely showing a slight curve under her shirt that could have been anything. Now it was unmistakable, enormous, the kind of belly that announces itself before the woman carrying it can say a word. Wren. She waited. I know I don't have any right to be here. I know that. I'm not going to pretend I do. He took his hands off the gate, put them in his pockets, took them out again. Garrett had never known what to do with his hands during conversations that mattered, which was one of the reasons he avoided them. I'm not here for the money. I know you don't have money. I'm not here to ask you to take me back. I know you won't. Then why are you here? I want to be there when the baby comes. I want to know the baby. I want to be part of it, not of you and me. That's done. I know that's done. But the baby is mine too, and I want... You left before sunrise without a word. You took the truck. You took the emergency money from the kitchen drawer. You left me pregnant and broke in a rented room. You did that. I know. And now you're standing at a gate you didn't build looking at a garden, you didn't plant on a hill, you didn't climb, and you're telling me you want to be part of something. He didn't answer right away. The cicadas filled the silence with that sawing pulse. The bees hummed from behind the house. A breeze came up the hill from the creek and moved through the cedars with a sound like someone running their hand across a curtain. I was scared, Wren. That's not an excuse. I know it's not an excuse, but I was scared. And scared is the only true thing I can say about why I left. Wren looked at him. She looked at him the way she looked at fabric before cutting. Measuring, calculating where the grain ran, deciding where to place the scissors. She had imagined this moment. Not often and not with any sentimentality, but she had imagined it lying on the kitchen floor in the early weeks before the hive boxes were cleaned, and before the garden was cleared, and before Odessa, and before the coins. She had imagined what she would feel if Garrett came back. Rage, she thought, or grief, or the worst one, relief. She felt none of those. What she felt was steady, the stone counter under her hands in the morning, the creek running at the bottom of the hill, the 51 marks on the doorframe, each one a year of a man choosing to stay. You'll decide about your father later, she said. And she was talking to the baby now, not to Garrett, though he could hear it. That's your choice to make when you're old enough to make it. But right now, right here, it's you and me. That's what I can promise. That's what I'm promising. Garrett stood at the gate, his chin dropped. Not a nod, a collapse, small and private, the kind of giving way that happens when a person hears the truth spoken out loud and doesn't have anything left to put in front of it. He turned around. He walked down the track. The truck door stuck, and he hip-checked it open the way he always had. The engine caught on the second try. He drove down the county road slowly the way he'd come, and the sound of the Silverado faded into the valley until it was just the creek and the bees and the wind in the cedars. Wren went inside. She sat down on the kitchen floor. Her spot now the spot where she read and rested and talked to the baby, and she shook. Not crying, shaking. The adrenaline leaving her body the way water leaves a wrung cloth in waves, until there was nothing left but the weight of what she'd done and the lightness of having done it. Cleet lay down next to her. He put his chin on her thigh. She put her hand on his head and felt his skull warm under her palm. The solid, simple fact of a living thing choosing to be next to her. She made a mark on the doorframe that evening. The date. 47 inches. And next to it, he came for the baby. I said no. Still here. September arrived. The way September arrives in the Ozarks. The morning sharp, the afternoon still warm, the light shifting from the white blaze of summer to something lower and more golden, the color of sourwood honey. The cedars stayed green, but the oaks along the creek began to turn first at the edges, then deeper rusting from the outside in. Wren had been feeling the small contractions for 2 days, not real ones, practice rounds. Odessa called them the body rehearsing for the show. She'd read about them in Hollis's notebook, not in the sections about birth because Hollis didn't write about birth, but in the sections about bees. A hive prepares for swarming days before it swarms. The bees know, they practice. They cluster and disperse until the queen is ready, and then everything happens at once. Wren thought about that every time a contraction came and went, cluster and disperse. At 1 in the morning on September 9th, a contraction came and did not disperse. It started low and built and held. And when it finally released, Wren was on her hands and knees on the kitchen floor, with her forehead against the cool stone, breathing in the way that wasn't her mother's 3-breath count, but something older, something the body knew without being taught. She reached for Cleet. He was already awake, already standing, already looking at her with that expression dogs get when they understand something is happening that requires them. She tied the red ribbon to his collar. The signal, the one she and Odessa had agreed on in July, a red ribbon from her sewing box, the same ribbon she'd used to bind the buttonholes on her mother's last dress. Cleet nosed the door open, slipped through, and was gone into the dark. Wren lit the lamp. She put water on the stove. She laid out the towels she'd been washing and boiling once a week for the last month. She set the scissors on the counter, her sewing scissors freshly sharpened on the whetstone from Hollis's root cellar. Clean enough for thread, clean enough for this. Another contraction. She held the edge of the counter and breathed. The lamp threw shadows across the kitchen, and the doorframe, with its marks, caught the light, all of them. Hollis's 51, and her own small row beneath the dates and measurements of a life assembling itself on a hill that nobody had wanted. Odessa came in 40 minutes. Wren heard her before she saw her. The iron would stick on the path fast, but not running the pace of a woman who had done this many times and knew that hurrying didn't help. But being late was worse. The door opened, and Odessa was there in a dark dress with a canvas sack over her shoulder. The lamp in Wren's kitchen catching the white of her braid, and she set the sack on the counter and began unpacking without a word. Clean cloths, twine, a jar of something dark and herbal that smelled like the creek bank after rain, a pair of scissors older and heavier than Wren's, wrapped in a cloth that had been washed so many times it was translucent. How far apart? 6 minutes, maybe 5. Odessa washed her hands in the basin. She knelt next to Wren, who was on the floor now, because the floor was where her body wanted to be, and she put one hand on Wren's belly and closed her eyes and felt the way a person listens with their hands when their ears aren't enough. She's low. She's ready. How do you know it's a she? Odessa opened her eyes. I don't, but I've delivered 31 babies in this valley, and I've been wrong twice. Both times it was a Tuesday, 2 days Thursday. We're fine. Wren laughed. It came out as half a laugh and half a groan because another contraction was building, and Odessa's hand stayed on her belly through its steady, warm, the pressure of someone who was not afraid of the pain, because she understood what it was building toward. The hours passed, the way hours pass during labor, in a rhythm that has nothing to do with clocks. Contraction and rest. Contraction and rest. Odessa talking low, telling her when to push and when to wait, wiping her forehead with a cloth dipped in cool water from the well, adjusting her position. With hands that had done this so many times, they moved without instruction. At some point, Wren opened her eyes between contractions and saw the doorframe from the floor from below, the way she'd never seen it. The marks ran up the wood in a column, Hollis's 51 years climbing toward the lintel, her own small additions at the bottom. From this angle, lying on the stone floor with her knees up and her back against the folded blankets Odessa had positioned behind her, the marks looked like a ladder, not going up, going forward. Each one a rung someone had gripped on the way to the next year. She thought, I'm going to add another mark after this. And then she stopped thinking about anything, because the last contraction came, the one that wasn't a wave but a wall. And Odessa said, push, and she pushed. And the sound she made was not a scream, but something deeper and more private, the sound of a body doing the single hardest thing it was designed to do. 7:15 in the morning. September sun through the kitchen window, that low golden September light falling across the stone floor in a rectangle that reached almost to where Wren lay. The baby came into that light. Odessa caught her with both hands, small, wet, furious. Her face red and compressed, and her mouth open in a cry that filled the kitchen. the way the bees filled the air. A sound that meant alive, alive, alive. Odessa cleared the airway, cut the cord with the old scissors, wrapped the baby in the cleanest cloth, and placed her on Wren's chest where the baby's cheek settled against the skin above Wren's heart. And the crying stopped. Not because the baby was calm, but because the baby had found the sound she'd been listening to for 9 months from the inside, and now she could hear it from the outside, and it was the same sound, and that was enough. Wren's hands came up around her. Both hands. The baby weighed nothing and everything. 7 pounds 2 ounces, Odessa would say later. But in that moment she weighed exactly what she was supposed to weigh, which was the weight of a life beginning on a floor where another life had stood for 51 years, measuring itself against a doorframe because there was no one else to say, "I see you, you're still here." "June," Wren said. Her voice was ruined and raw and quiet. "Your name is June, after your grandmother's middle name, and after the month I found this place. This is your kitchen. This is your hill. The man who lived here before us kept bees and grew herbs and measured himself on that doorframe right there. He left us what he had. We're going to take care of it." Odessa sitting on the floor with her back against the counter, and her apron dark with work, and her hands finally resting in her lap, said nothing for a long time. Then she said, strong lungs and the mouth tight, like her mother's, "She's going to have opinions." Wren laughed. This time it was all laugh. No groan, and it hurt in a way that was also joy. And June startled at the vibration and gripped Wren's collarbone with fingers so small they couldn't close around anything, but tried anyway. The years after that moved the way years move on a hill where someone is paying attention. Not fast, not slow, but full. Wren sold honey at the Wednesday market in Cellar and herbs and later tinctures and salves made from recipes in Hollis's notebooks that Odessa taught her to refine. The garden terraces filled. The hives multiplied 4, then 7, then 11. The stone house held. Odessa walked the creek path until she was 82 when her knees said no, and she listened because she had always listened to things that told the truth. She stayed in her cabin, but Wren came to her twice a week with June on her hip, and then at her side, and then running ahead. When Odessa died at 84 in her bed in winter, with the wood stove warm and Cleet's successor, a pup from the Strack farm named Dill, sleeping at her feet, she left Wren the ironwood walking stick and the canvas sack, and 40 years of knowing that the best way to help someone is to stand next to them and point and then step back. June grew up the way children grow up on land that someone loves close to the ground, dirty need knowing the names of things. She knew which herbs were for tea and which were for medicine, and which were for the bees for medicine, and which were for the bees. She knew how to read clouds and split kindling and stitch a straight seam, because Wren taught her to sew the same way Lenore had taught Wren by handing her the scissors and saying, "Cut along the line, and if you go crooked, rip it out and start again." Because nobody ever learned anything by being afraid of the seam ripper. On an afternoon in June, the month, not the girl. Though the girl was there too 7 years after the morning, she was born on the kitchen floor. June stood on a stool in front of the doorframe and held very still while Wren made a mark. The pencil line sat at 3 feet 11 inches, below Hollis's 51 years. Below Wren's marks, the belly measurements, the dates, the small notations that had grown into their own record. Bees returned. He came. I stayed. June born here. 3 lives on one doorframe. A column of proof that someone had stood in this spot and said year after year the same thing without ever saying it out loud. June stepped off the stool and looked at her mark. She looked at the ones above it. The long column of Hollis's, the shorter column of her mother's. She reached up and touched the highest mark she could reach, which happened to be one of Wren's early ones. And then she touched the lowest, which was Hollis's last, the shaky one from 2018 that had started everything. Was Mr. Hollis sad that nobody measured with him? Wren put the pencil behind her ear. She picked up June and settled her on her hip, which she could still do at 7, though not for much longer, and she looked at the doorframe with her daughter. He wasn't measuring alone. Every mark was him saying, "I'm still here." And now you're saying it too. And one day your kids will say it after you, and his marks will still be at the top right where he put them. And yours will be right where you put yours, and none of them will be lonely, because they are all on the same door. June thought about that. She had the thinking face, the tight mouth, the eyes that went sideways and then came back. Odessa's description from the day she was born had been exactly right. Opinions. "Can I see the box?" Wren went to the root cellar. The tin box was where it had always been, on the shelf behind the door, with the 5 words carved across the top. She brought it up and set it in June's lap on the porch, where the September light, the same golden September light from the morning June was born, lay across the boards like a quilt. June opened it carefully, the way Wren had taught her to open things along the grain, not against it. Inside the letter, cream-colored, still folded. The key iron, small, no longer needed for anything but too important to throw away, and nothing else. No coins, no silver, no money of any kind. Where did the coins go? Into the roof, into the seeds, into the hive boxes, into the crib you slept in, into the first winter when we didn't have enough to buy flour and the coins bought us 4 months of eating. They're still here, June. Every one of them. They just don't look like coins anymore. They look like the garden. They look like the beehives. They look like the house. They look like you. June held the box in her lap. She looked at the letter but didn't open it. She'd read it when she was older, when the handwriting of a man who'd been dead for years would mean something different than it meant now. She looked at the key. She picked it up and held it in her palm, feeling the weight of a small iron thing that had once opened a door that changed everything. Then she closed the box and held it against her chest. The way you hold things that matter, not tight enough to damage them, tight enough that they know they're held. Wren sat next to her on the porch. Dill was asleep in the sun with his paws twitching, chasing something in a dream. The bees were working the last goldenrod of the season, heavy and slow, bringing in the final stores before the cold. The creek ran. The cedar stood. The light came through them in shafts that moved across the hillside like hands turning pages. On the door frame inside the kitchen, the marks went from 1967 to this morning. 3 lives worth of people standing in the same spot and making a line and writing a date. Not because anyone asked them to, not because it proved anything to anyone else, because the act of marking, of putting pencil to wood and saying, "This is where I stood. This is when I stood here. This is how tall I was, or how round I was, or how much I'd grown," is the oldest way humans have of saying the thing that matters most, which is not. I was here, but I'm still here. And the door remembers. If you've ever made a mark on a wall, a doorframe, a growth chart, a pencil line in a closet where you measured your kids every September, you know what Hollis knew. You know what Wren knows. You know that the mark is never about the height. It's about the standing. It's about the showing up. It's about one more year of putting your back against the wood and holding still long enough for someone to draw the line. Tell me in the comments, is there a mark somewhere in your house that nobody else would notice, but that means everything to you? A line on a doorframe, a dent in a floor, a spot on a wall where someone once stood and said without saying it, "I'm still here, tell me about it." We read every one. And if this story stayed with you tonight, if it's sitting in your chest, the way a warm drink sits in your hands on a cold porch, subscribe. The next one might be about a hill you recognize, or a box you've been keeping, or a door you haven't opened yet.